In the winter of 1933, a laid-off steelworker in Youngstown, Ohio, walked 3 miles in worn boots to a hiring line outside a foundry on Poland Avenue. 42 men stood in front of him. 2 jobs were available. He was hired before the foreman reached the 11th man in line. He was not the strongest. He was not the youngest. He was not the cheapest. He had taken off his cap, looked the foreman in the eye, and done 4 specific things in the next 90 seconds that no other man in that line had done. He kept that job for 26 years. When he died in 1971, his sons found a small notebook in his dresser drawer. It contained 25 lines, written in pencil, in a hand that had stopped school in the 6th grade. They did not call it charm. They called it bearing, the way a man carried himself when he had nothing else to carry. The Depression took the houses, the savings, the pensions, and the pride of an entire generation of American working men. It did not take the code. The code was the last thing a poor man owned. The men who held on to it survived in ways the desperate men around them did not. Then the war came. Then the suburbs came. Then the credit cards came. Somewhere between 1955 and today, we decided a man no longer needed to know how to walk into a room with empty pockets and leave with a friend. We replaced the code with a credit limit. The loneliness numbers have been climbing ever since. Number 22 on this list took less than 4 seconds and made the average Depression-era job seeker more likely to be hired than men with twice his experience. Number 14 contradicted every piece of modern self-help advice, and the men who lived by it were the men whose marriages lasted 50 years on a laborer's wage. Number 3, the rule Depression fathers drilled into their sons more fiercely than any other is now being taught in executive leadership programs that charge $12,000 a seat. These 25 secrets were not about being smooth. They were about being remembered when you had nothing else to offer. They were the difference between a man who stood in a hiring line and disappeared and a man who stood in the same line and walked home with work. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 lost poor man charm secrets Depression-era fathers taught their sons that made them unforgettable. Number 25. The cap in the left hand. When a poor man approached any door, the cap came off with the right hand and went into the left, brim down. You did not put it back on until you were outside again. For a coal miner's son in 1934, West Virginia, walking up to a farm to ask for harvest work, the cap was the entire introduction. The farmer saw it before the boy spoke. He was fed lunch before he was offered the work. By 1935, the gesture was so universal across Appalachian hiring culture that farmers who hired men without the cap removal were considered poor judges of character. The cap said this boy had a father. The work followed the gesture. Number 24. The borrowed shave. A poor man going into any moment that mattered shaved that morning, even if he had to borrow the razor. You scraped the jaw clean. You used soap if you had it, water if you did not. For a 30-year-old machinist in 1932, Akron, walking to a tire plant for a 3rd interview, the shave was the difference. He had borrowed the razor from his brother-in-law. The foreman noticed. Across every industrial city in the Depression, foremen kept private rules about appearance that they never wrote down, and a clean jaw was the first one. A shaved man was a man who had not yet given up. The smooth jaw is the last flag a poor man flies. Number 23. The refusal to sit down first. You did not sit until the other man sat. You stood with your hat in your hand and waited. For a Pittsburgh widower in 1935 who called on a parish priest about a job recommendation, the standing was a sentence. The priest gestured. The widower sat. The recommendation was written that afternoon. In Catholic working-class culture across the industrial Midwest, this rule was so iron that a man who sat without invitation could be quietly blacklisted by an entire parish within a week. A poor man could not afford to seat himself on another man's furniture. Number 22. Look the foreman in the eye for 3 full seconds. Not at his shoes, not at his clipboard. Look at his eyes. 3 seconds, then down, then up again. For a 22-year-old farm boy in 1933 in Iowa, standing at a packing plant gate in Cedar Rapids, those 3 seconds were the only resume he had. The foreman saw eyes that did not flinch and did not beg. The Department of Labor recorded in 1936 that foremen in meatpacking, steel, and rail consistently described their best hires using almost identical language, saying the man had looked them straight in the eye. The eyes said this man had been somewhere before he arrived here. Number 21. The handshake that met the bone. Not crushing, not theatrical. Firm enough that the other man felt the bone of your hand against his. One pulse released. For a brakeman's son in Kansas City in 1934, meeting his future father-in-law on a porch in Argentine, the handshake was the whole conversation. The older man felt the grip and nodded once. The boy was permitted to court the daughter. In railroad families across the Central Plains, the bone grip was so codified that a limp handshake from a suitor was considered grounds to refuse him without further discussion. A poor father would not let a son fail that signal twice. Number 20. The letter written by hand. A Depression father who needed a favor wrote a letter by hand in the best penmanship he could manage. For a furloughed engineer in Scranton in 1932, writing to a foreman in Altoona about winter work, the handwritten letter was the entire application. The penmanship was poor. The grammar was poorer. The job came back by return mail. Across the Pennsylvania Railroad corridor, foremen kept these letters in desk drawers for years and hired from the stack when work opened up. A letter said the man had given the matter his Sunday afternoon. No telephone call could carry that weight. Number 19. Pay what you owe before the asking. If a poor man owed another man 50 cents, he found that man on Friday evening and put the 50 cents in his hand before he could remember to ask. For a Brooklyn dock worker in 1934, walking 3 blocks to repay a $50 borrowed for medicine, the Friday payment was the entire reputation. The neighbor had forgotten. He remembered now. The dock worker could borrow $10 from him for the rest of his life. In Italian, Irish, and Polish neighborhoods across the city, the Friday repayment was so universal that men who waited to be asked were quietly cut from every informal lending circle on the block. Number 18. The shoes polished with lard. When a poor man had no shoe polish, he used kitchen lard, a rag, and worked the leather until it shined. For a Cleveland husband in 1935, walking his wife to a wedding at St. Stanislaus Church, the polished shoes were the whole tuxedo he could not afford. The other men's wives noticed. Among the Slavic and Hungarian parishes of the industrial Midwest, the lard polish was so common that priests could identify the families who had kept the discipline by the way the men's shoes caught the light in the pew. Poverty was not the shame. Poverty that had not been answered with a rag and an hour of work was the shame. Number 17. The quiet question about the children. When you met another man at a hiring line or a soup kitchen, the first question after the name was about his children. How many? How old? How is the youngest? For a Tennessee sharecropper in 1933, riding in a boxcar headed to Detroit, That question opened the stranger across from him completely. By the time the train reached Toledo, the two men had agreed to share a rooming house. Among the millions of men who rode the rails between 1931 and 1936, this question was the universal credential. Every poor man had children. Every poor man had been waiting to be asked. Number 16. Carry the heavy thing for the woman in the hallway, without asking, without being thanked, without speaking. For a Polish laborer in 1934 in a Hamtramck tenement, carrying a bucket of coal up 3 flights for a widow he had never met. The gesture was 20 seconds of his Tuesday evening. The widow's son saw it from the landing. The son was a foreman at the Dodge plant. The laborer had a job interview by Thursday. Across every immigrant tenement in industrial America, this kind of unspoken neighborly labor was tracked silently by whole buildings, and reputations were built and destroyed by it within weeks. Here is what the history books do not say plainly enough. By 1933, the official unemployment rate was nearly 25%. In some industrial cities, it was over 50%. There were no food stamps. There was no unemployment insurance worth mentioning. There were no credit cards, no second mortgages, no overdraft protection. There was a man, his hat, his hand, his word, and his neighbors. That was the entire safety net. The men who survived this period did not survive because they were stronger than the men who did not. They survived because they had been raised inside a code that allowed strangers to trust them inside of 90 seconds. A man whose handshake met the bone and whose eyes did not flinch could get a meal in any town in America in 1933. A man without the code could starve 2 blocks from a church full of food. We have spent 80 years building systems to replace the code. The systems work. The men have gotten lonelier every decade since. Number 15. The compliment to another man's wife in front of him. Not flirtation. A direct, respectful compliment to her cooking, her garden, her singing in the church choir. Spoken to her in his presence. For a Pennsylvania miner in 1933 sitting at a friend's Sunday dinner in Wilkes Barre, the compliment to the wife about her bread was the entire afternoon. He was invited back every Sunday for 11 years. In Welsh and Slavic mining communities across the anthracite region, this small ritual was understood as the highest form of respect a guest could pay his host. A man who praised another man's wife correctly had announced he understood the marriage was the man's whole fortune. Number 14. Refuse the last slice. When food was set on a table and a plate came around, you did not take the last piece of anything. You insisted it go to another man, a child, the host. For a Kentucky tobacco picker in 1934, sitting at a Louisville boarding house dinner, the refused last biscuit was a daily discipline. The landlady did not raise the rent on him for 3 years. Across the boarding house, culture that housed roughly 20 million Americans during the Depression, this refusal was the single most reliable signal a landlady used to decide who stayed and who was asked to leave. A poor man who refused the last piece was already full of something more important than bread. Number 13. The walk that did not hurry. A poor man did not run. He did not appear flustered on any street in any weather. He walked at a measured pace that said the city had not yet defeated him. For a furloughed Baltimore shipyard worker in 1932, walking 2 miles from Fells Point to a daily hiring call at the harbor, the walk was the whole performance. Men passed him hurrying. He did not hurry. Among waterfront foremen from Baltimore to New Orleans, the measured walk was a known signal, and they hired the rhythm before they hired the back. The hurried men went home empty. Number 12. The tobacco offered before the conversation. When 2 men met on a stoop or a corner, The first gesture was the tobacco pouch held out. Even if the other man rolled his own, even if he refused. For a Missouri farmhand in 1933, meeting a stranger at a crossroads outside Joplin, the offered tobacco was the handshake that did not require touching. Across the rural Midwest and the Ozarks, this offering was so universal that a man who failed to extend it was understood to be either ill, in mourning, or unsafe to talk to. A poor man who offered first had announced he was not measuring the other man's pockets. Number 11. Sit on the porch without speaking. A poor man could sit next to another poor man on a porch step for 30 minutes without saying a word and call it a fine evening. For a Georgia mill worker's father in 1934, sitting beside his oldest son after a 14-hour shift at the cotton mill in Columbus, the silence was the whole conversation. In Southern Milltown culture, this kind of porch silence between men was so deeply understood that disturbing it with small talk was considered a minor act of rudeness. The Depression generation knew the silence was the intimacy. Speech was what you used when the silence had broken down. Number 10. The hat tipped to every woman. Every woman. The grocer's daughter, the cleaning woman walking to the trolley at 5 in the morning, the mother carrying groceries up the hill. 2 fingers on the brim, a slight nod. For a Detroit auto worker in 1935, walking 7 blocks from his rooming house to the Cadillac plant, the hat was tipped 40 times before he reached the gate. Across industrial neighborhoods from Detroit to Pittsburgh to Chicago, this discipline was so consistent that women in the 1980s still recalled by name the men who had tipped to them as girls. A poor man's currency was attention. He spent it everywhere. Number 9. Bring the tool, not the excuse. When a neighbor said he needed help with a fence or a stuck door, a poor man arrived the next morning with the tool already in his hand. No conversation, no promises. For a Czech carpenter in Cleveland in 1933, walking to his neighbor's house on a Saturday morning with his own claw hammer, the tool was the entire reply to a sentence spoken on Wednesday. The neighbor's son brought him work for the next 40 years. In Eastern European immigrant neighborhoods, this principle was so foundational that a man who arrived empty-handed after promising help was understood to have insulted the entire household. In 1937, sociologists at the University of Chicago conducted interviews in working-class neighborhoods across 6 American cities. They wanted to understand how men with no money built reputations strong enough to get them hired, fed, and trusted by strangers. The pattern they found was consistent across every ethnic group, every region, every trade. The men who fared best during the Depression were not the men with the most skills. They were the men whose neighbors could describe them with 3 or 4 small, specific behaviors. He always paid back. He always took off his cap. He always carried something when he came to the door. He never sat until he was asked to sit. The researchers called these men high reputation actors. The fathers who raised them called them men who had been brought up right. The same study, repeated in 2009, found that fewer than 4% of American men under 50 exhibited any of the behaviors at all. The code had not failed. The code had been forgotten. Number 8. The story told about the father. When a poor man wanted another man to trust him, he did not talk about himself. He told a short story about his father. For an Alabama railroad porter in 1934 talking to a new supervisor at Union Station in Birmingham, the story about his father walking 11 miles to repay a borrowed dollar in 1908 was the entire interview. The supervisor heard the son in the story and hired him. Across black railroad culture in the Jim Crow South, this rhetorical pattern was a survival technology, allowing a man to vouch for himself by vouching for a man who had already passed the test of time. Number 7. The coffee poured for the other man first. When two men sat at a counter and the cups arrived, you slid your cup toward the other man and waited. He pushed it back. You drank second. For a Toledo glassworker in 1933, meeting a union steward at a diner on Cherry Street, the coffee gesture was the entire negotiation. Within a week, the placement came through. In union halls and diners across the industrial belt, this gesture was so universally understood as a sign of good raising that union men used it as a quiet test of new recruits. A poor man could not buy lunch. He could move a cup 6 inches and say everything that needed saying. Number 6. The compliment 3 days late. When you noticed something about another man, you did not mention it that day. You waited 3 days, then said it casually on a corner. For a New Jersey ironworker in 1935, noticing his neighbor had repainted his porch railing on Tuesday and mentioning it on Friday, the delay was the whole gift. An immediate compliment was flattery. A compliment 3 days later was proof you had been thinking about him. In tight working-class blocks, where everyone saw everything within an hour, the delayed compliment was the only one that carried weight, because it could not be mistaken for politeness. Number 5. Eat slowly when you are starving. A poor man who was genuinely hungry ate at the same pace as the other men at the table. He never finished first. For a laid-off steelworker in 1932 in Gary, Indiana, eating a charity meal at a Polish parish hall, slow eating was the only dignity he had left. The pastor watched. A bed was offered for the winter. Across the soup kitchens and parish halls that fed millions during the Depression, clergy and matrons used eating pace as the single fastest read on a man's character. The pace of the fork was the last fortress. Number 4. The 2-word apology. I'm sorry. Nothing else. No explanation. No defense. 2 words, eye contact, and silence. For a Buffalo bricklayer in 1934 who had spoken too loudly to a neighbor's wife on the stoop and walked back the next morning to apologize, the 2 words were the entire repair. Across Catholic working-class culture from Buffalo to Boston, the short apology was understood as the only manly one, because anything longer was a defense disguised as contrition. A man who could give a short apology had announced his pride was smaller than his manners. Number 3. Keep the promise to the child. When a poor man told a child he would do something, he did it, without exception. Even if it cost him money he did not have, even if it cost him a half-day's walk. For a Mississippi sawmill worker in 1933, walking 9 miles on a Sunday afternoon to bring his niece a promised piece of peppermint, the kept promise was the entire inheritance he could leave her. She remembered it for 61 years. She told her own grandchildren in 1994. The promise had outlived the man, the mill, the peppermint, and the Depression itself. A poor man could not leave money. He could leave a memory of a Sunday. Number 2. Speak less than the other man. In any conversation with any person, a poor man tried to speak less than the man across from him. For a Cincinnati streetcar conductor in 1935, talking to a passenger on the late shift about the man's son in the war, the conductor spoke for less than 90 seconds across a 20-minute conversation. The passenger arrived home and told his wife about the kind young man on the streetcar. The wife's brother owned a printing shop. The conductor had a better job within a month. A poor man's silence was not emptiness. It was the room he gave another man to fill with himself. Number 1. Show up. That is it. When you said you would be there, you were there. Before the time. In any weather. For any reason. For a Pennsylvania mill town father in 1933, walking 4 miles in a January snowstorm to attend his nephew's first communion at St. Casimir's because he had said 3 weeks earlier that he would be there, the showing up was the whole life. He sat in the back pew, wet and cold, and nodded at the boy at the rail. The nephew remembered the nod for 60 years. He spoke of it at the man's funeral in 1989. The man had owned 3 suits in his life, 2 pairs of work boots, and 1 watch that did not run. He had shown up to everything he had ever said he would show up to. There was no greater fortune available to a poor man in America in 1933, and there is no greater fortune available to any man today. The rest of the rules are decoration. This one was the whole house. None of this required money. None of it required schooling past the 6th grade. None of it required a coach, a podcast, a book, or a single dollar spent on instruction. It required a father, an uncle, a foreman, a porch, and 30 years of being corrected without complaint. The cap in the left hand, the handshake that met the bone, the eyes that held for 3 seconds. The tobacco offered first. The coffee slid across the counter. The promise kept to the child. The body that arrived through the snow because the mouth had said it would. These were the gestures, the small things that made a man who he was, the hand that showed respect. These were not the habits of phonies. These were the habits of men who had been stripped of everything money could buy and had decided that what remained, the bearing, the word, the attention, the showing up, was worth more than what had been taken. They were right. The grandsons forgot. The great-grandsons never knew. The code is still here. The doorway is still there. The cap is still in the hand of any man who chooses to take it off. The only thing the Depression generation knew that we forgot is this. A poor man with the code was never poor in the only currency that ever mattered. He was always going to be remembered. We have the houses now. We have the cars. We have everything they did not have. We are the ones who have become invisible.